Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome to our employment panel focused on the pandemic impacts to the employment contracts. Before moving to our agenda today, I would like to make a very quick introduction of our panelists. We are very pleased to have and welcome Alfredo Soares, Principal of Mercer, Renata Andrade, HR, Employment and Social Security Associate at Mercer, Marina Bouri, Litigation Coordination at Speak Brazil, my employment partner, Priscila Kirchhoff, as well as Paulo Carvalho, the Senior Associate of our Social Security Department. So moving to the agenda slide, we will have a quick view of our topics today. We will begin with a quick view of what we expect to be the future of work, especially after the pandemic. We will then hear from Mercer about the actual market practices that they are seeing right now as a result of this new way of working. After Mercer, we will have a chance to hear directly from Marina regarding the reality of this scenario from the actual employer's perspective. And after that, we will move to the respective legal aspects covering both employment and tax matters, including Social Security. Please do feel free to send your questions through the chat, and we will do our best to answer them during the panel. If that's not possible, we will revert back to you afterwards through email. So with that, in the interest of time, we have a lot to cover today. Let's start talking about the future of work, and we can move on and stay a bit on slide 4. So now talking about the future of work, most employers around the globe have already accepted that the COVID-19 pandemic has changed the future of work. Since the start of the pandemic, whenever possible, employees have been working from home in unprecedented numbers. It's likely that the concept of remote work, whether it is exceptional, permanent, or somewhere in between, will be the norm for the future, especially since for many, the work from home experience has been surprisingly successful. But each organization is different, and what works for one company may not really work for another. And of course, there are challenges to be faced in this new structure, including how to effectively onboard new hires, how to maintain the company's culture and engagement, even from a distance. And we have to continue focusing on the growing employee experience. Right now, working from home is the rule for many, but once the pandemic is under control and there is the possibility to work from the company's premises again, it will be important to properly define who will continue to work remotely on a full-time basis or only part of the time. There are various employment law issues to consider at this time. And as with any program, setting out a clear policy on the eligibility criteria while reserving the right of employers to determine which positions can be performed remotely is key. It's also important to know how to build a productive environment in a remote setting and set forth objective criteria for rejecting and accepting potential applications to change the work format. This will certainly be helpful to mitigate different treatment and even discrimination discussions in the future. Another aspect is where the services will be provided, because that does matter. For Brazilian employment law purposes, the employee should be submitted to the union and collective bargaining agreement of the place where the services are provided. So having an employee working from a completely different state within the Brazilian territory can trigger certain changes, including the applicable collective bargaining agreement. Among other actions, Brazilian employers will also need to implement a revised expense reimbursement policy, clearly defining limits for this new reality. We have actually faced some practical situations where a gray area within those policies was leaving room for discussion between employees and employers. Even though statutes and case law are still evolving, it's very important to confirm that the employees actually have the adequate equipment for the services that they'll provide. Just like when the work was provided within the company's premises, the employer can be held liable for any working injuries or diseases, even if they occur while the employee is working from home or remotely. Health and safety concerns must also consider the mental health, as we are seeing an increase in employees alleging that they have burnout syndrome for being online and available most of the day. Another important aspect that must be considered and addressed refers to time control and overtime hours pay. In Brazil, remote work was included as one of the exceptions provided in Brazilian Labor Code. However, if the employer ends up performing time control through electronic or any other means, the employee shall actually become entitled to the payment of overtime. So it's important not to transform contacts held with the employee to ensure productivity, engagement, as I said, into an indirect form of time control. These are only some of the aspects that we will be covering today and addressing now with our guests and colleagues. So with that, I'm happy to turn over to my friends at Mercer for them to share with us what the market has been doing and should be doing once the pandemic is over. Alfredo and Renata, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Leticia. It's a pleasure to be here with all the speakers and participating, trying to bring some feedback, ideas that the market have been, showing us since the beginning of this strange situation. Moving to the next slide, definitely what we've been identifying from starting is that we are living in different times. It's a moment where every single country and person, in a sense, was affected all around the world. And this, I believe, is a single event that is happening for the first time. In this sense, what we've been collecting from the different clients have been first a reaction to the situation that starting in February, March, spread across the world and forced everybody to adapt and adjust to a reality that they were not even expecting, foreseeing, or in anybody's minds. But once that reality hit everybody, they needed to first take some measures, immediate measures, on how to deal with all the employees that had to be protected and put in place in safe place. Looking at the duration of the situation, how long would the pandemic emergency would last, short, mid, long term, and if the long term would be a reality, how would they adjust and how they revisit some policies in regards to how they manage compensation, on how they manage talent development, performance, and hiring, and how would organizations would be reevaluated in terms of their workforce, in terms of their place of operations, because definitely today, with everybody at home, we don't need big office spaces. We don't need big spaces to accommodate people in a general mode. So we can definitely handle reality of the business in a very different way. But it was a moment to understand, where do I stand, what do I need to change, and how do I prepare myself for the future. And that's, in a sense, in a nutshell, what we bring to you, showing as we move to the next slide on the reaction of the company. So as I mentioned to you, when we thought about the impact of this reality, if we were, facing a reality of 3 months, definitely, the business would be impacted, but would be a short thing. And based on the experience of Brazil in 2015 with economic crisis, that would be just a small adjustment to a recovery that was expected for 2020 in terms of the economy, and that would be easily absorbed by the business with no big problems. If we would move towards 6 months, and that's where we are getting close to, then we would be facing something more than just this health crisis. It would turn into an economic crisis, something more larger, and with a deep impact on how we do things, on how businesses handle and interact among themselves. And if we go beyond that timeline, definitely it will be something more difficult to handle from a business perspective. But despite of these three ways of seeing the impact of the health crisis, companies start reacting, thinking in terms of, how do I protect my employees? How do I protect their jobs? How do I protect the business, making sure that after the crisis we will have something that will survive and will last to move forward. And in this sense, we start observing a lot in the way of companies stretching strategic partnerships with other companies. So going beyond the concept of competition, going beyond the concept of dividing secrets or being very individual, and you start seeing different staffing models, different ways to cope with the employee staffing model, the same way that technology, artificial intelligence, and automation, played a big role, bringing and implementing new ways of reaching to my client. So the e-commerce had a boost. The industry of retail had also a big boost, because moving people home, that would require people to acquire their food and be staying home, while in the past they used to go to restaurants and other public areas. So the need to business to adapt and prepare themselves to this situation was definitely a huge incentive. Also to look at how compensation is being done, how some benefits are being offered, bonuses, long-term incentives, and some benefits regarding mobility, transportation, that had to be reviewed. Also, the structure. How can I do my operation with the same staff? Can I reduce? Where do I reduce? Do I reduce because of cost, or do I reduce because of more efficiency? And that's a key element when we talk about how companies prepare themselves to handle this pandemic reality. I will ask Renata now to go through a survey outputs that are very, very interesting, especially to see how this working from home is operating or working in a sense, and how companies are being adapted to that reality. Moving to the next slide, and Renata, please.
Okay, thank you, Alfredo. Before we start the market practice, I would like to share with you that I saw in our global survey on business response to COVID-19, over 70% of the companies will review their remote working policies on next 3 to 6 months. However, are they clear on exactly what needs to be reviewed to getting back to work post-COVID-19? Think about that. Mercer promotes a local survey with more than 600 companies from different sectors in Brazil to obtain the market practice about work from home during the COVID and the pause that I will share on the next slide. So in this next slide, you can see that the company, what equipment and allowance that the companies have been offered to their employees. For example, we have the 100%, the companies provide the notebook, the print, the officer supplies, laptop, food rest. In the other side, we have the allowance, the meal allowance, supplement the meal allowance or provide additional allowance to the meal as well as internet allowance. The total amount is around 200 reais for each allowance. Move it to the next slide, please. In this slide, we have the categories of flexible work of the several companies. And you can see that the more prevalent was the working from home. As a trend, we have the most of the companies intends to maintain the permanent working from home or remote work, telework policy after quarantine. And the main reason was primarily cost reduction, increased engagement, and it's important to emphasize the situation that I have been see in the most client that some employees does not feel safe to return to the physical environment of the company. Move it to the next, please. Here we can show the market trends, the eligible areas to permanent policy. You see the prevalence in the administrative areas, such as human resource, administrative, financial, legal. In the other hand, we have the category per areas, the remote working versus the working from home. And the working from home is prevalent in the market and maintained to the administrative areas. Next, please. Here, it's important to emphasize that the most company that participant on our survey telling for us that they had some cost reduction in approximately 18%, and other companies will be a huge reduced cost for migrate the working from home or the remote working after the pandemic. Alfredo, over to you.
Thanks, Renata. As you could observe, the outcomes are quite interesting. Definitely, companies that had working from home policies, they are the ones more suitable to see less impact. Although moving everybody to that kind of work is different from having few people on it, but companies that had nothing, they were pushed and forced to think and see it as, from a policy point of view. So it's definitely something that companies are now adopting and making huge changes. What are things that or takeaways that we should think after this presentation? Is definitely that this situation is an opportunity. It's an opportunity for everybody to do something different, to look at their own organization and see how their goals are goals that make sense from a business point of view and a community point of view. How careers, how performance assessments can be developed in a manner that I'm focused only on the delivery and not taking into consideration other informal elements that in the past, while we were all in the office sharing the same space, we used to consider. How the possibility of having people on a permanent basis working from home in a reality and in a culture like in Brazil that in the past was not even considered, was a very remote dream, and how I can definitely recompensate or compensate people in a different way. I need to be ingenious, I need to be smart, and I need to see how, the area that is conducting and managing all of these challenges from a governance point of view, the HR needs to be redesigned, needs to be assessed, because definitely HR is playing a different role today, and as we move to the next slide and last slide, we leave some challenges or ideas that in fact we don't know the future, and that's a great thing. That leaves us a lot of opportunities to be different and to be able to show the world that my company, my team is capable of amazing things. With this, I end the Mercer presentation and I pass to Marina.
Thank you, Alfredo. And I would like to thank Trent Rossi team for inviting me to participate in this incredible event. I'm very honored to be here, learning and sharing with these amazing professionals and colleagues. So going to the first slide, my mission here today is to talk a little about the challenges faced by the companies since the pandemic worsened in Brazil, and how organizations are dealing with this new working model, how to rethink the company's culture in this scenario, and how to engage our employees and ensure their well-being. We could talk about this subject for hours, but today I would like just to highlight some key points, as you can see in this slide, that I will address in the course of this presentation. These points are the result of my own experience inside the company, as well as a great sort of conversations I've had with colleagues from different sectors and from other companies. So moving to the next slide, please. First of all, it must be said that we broke down, please, we can come back a little, please. Thank you. It must be said that we broke down a huge paradigm related to the workplace. And together with it, we started to review our beliefs about productivity. Although many companies were already used to work from home model, most companies were not prepared to adopt this model for 100% of their employees, nor in a full-time basis. At the beginning of the pandemic, the question was if employees would be able to remain productive in front of such a sudden change in their work routine. It would be possible for everyone to remain committed to the company's goals and KPIs without the daily monitoring of their bosses. How would the company's leadership deal with the distance of its teams? But what a surprise when we realized that not only productivity had not fallen, but in many cases had increased. In Brazil, a survey conducted by FIA in partnership with the University of São Paulo found out that 71% of the executives believes that the performance at home is equal or better than that one inside the office. And more than that, recently, many employees already declared their wish to remain working from their homes even after after having a vaccine against COVID-19, at least for much of the week. But of course, that this new model brought us new and unknown challenges. So in the next slide, I would like to talk a little about one of them, which is related to leadership. So all at once, leaders had to support their teams in more than just their work routine as usual. Anxiety, fear, isolation, family issues, meetings with the participation of children, spouses, pets became recurrent. And the leaders go through this twice, by helping their employees and by living it inside their own places, inside their own homes. So a recent survey conducted by a professor at Curtin University in Australia, Sharon Parker, and she's also a researcher at the Center for Transformative Work Design, brought some interesting data regarding how remote work can damage managers' confidence. According to this survey, 40% of the managers who responded to this admitted a lack of confidence in their ability to lead employees remotely. They also stated that they did not believe that their employees could stay motivated in the long term if they remain working remotely. So on the staff side, the same survey found out that those who worked remotely more often reported being subjected to more monitoring by their superiors. And for those who reported high levels of monitoring, 49% were more anxious when carrying out their works. It brings to us a lot of thought, a lot to think of. Remote management requires different skills from those that the leaders has in face-to-face interaction. But many of them were thrown into this new way of working without prior notice and, of course, without prior training. It is the concept of emotional intelligence. But nowadays, the leaders must have a good emotional management, because it is impossible to engage people by being just a virtual leader. That kind of leader that believes that only by sending emails or messages, their role will succeed. It is necessary to improve our soft skills, improve our ability to be empathetic, to make true connection with people, to build relationships based on trust. But how to achieve that? Of course, I don't have all the answers, but in my experience, I believe that flexibility, accountability, and mainly transparent communication are good starts. I would dare to say that they are must-haves, but of course, it isn't easy at all. Moving to the next slide. At this point, there's something that we must keep in mind. The senior leadership of the company must be aligned on which paths to take. In many companies, and mine is one of them, special committees were created to discuss several issues regarding the impacts of the pandemic on the activities of teams, beyond the financial impacts and beyond the impacts on the operations. More than ever, the values of the company left the paper and were put into action. And in this context, HR department and marketing department became more vital than ever, and they have to work much more closely together. Because to be truly effective, communication has to be fast and transparent, but also the focus changed a little. Instead of just spreading the news of the company, it is necessary for marketing department and also for HR department to act as a facilitator for the dialogue between the company and the employee, to be a tool that brings information, but also brings comfort to people, focus on people. So another thing that has been undergoing transformation, and we can go to the next slide, is the employee's perception of the benefits offered by the employer. Many companies, when faced with the increasing stress and anxiety of the employees, started offering psychological support services and a great sort of online services that encourages the practice of physical exercises, for example, and even equipments to provide an ergonomic environment at home, as we saw at the survey that Renata was talking about. With the growing trend of remote work, even after the end of the pandemic, this type of benefit will certainly be factors considered by the professionals when joining or when leaving a company. Also, flexible working hours will be more valued than ever, because if it were possible to separate personal and professional life before, working from home mixed these two realities and generated new needs. Not everything that worked before the pandemic will remain working in the future. And to conclude my presentation and go into the next slide and the final slide, I would like just to quickly mention some other practices that have been discussed by companies in the context of technology. One of them is the need to develop or to improve a strong data protection base, since IT departments has to deal with a much larger number of vulnerabilities that may exist in the work from home environment. And this is necessary not only to preserve business information, but also to ensure the confidentiality of personal data. Imagine that companies nowadays are recruiting online, are hiring people online, and also are dismissing people through video conferences. And the companies have to guarantee people's security and privacy in this context. Another example, the adoption of digital signature has been expanded. If before companies were used to use digital signature only for less complex contracts, for instance, nowadays we are signing even employment contracts digitally. Also, corporate training programs needed to be adapted for online platforms, and even telemedicine procedures are being implemented. So all of this obviously requires a satisfactory information security infrastructure. And of course, especially in Brazil, it may involve some risks and liabilities, which I believe will be addressed by Priscilla. Thank you.
Thank you, Marina, and thank you everyone for joining us today in this event. It's really a big pleasure to have you all here. I'm going to discuss with you about the labor aspects of the telecommuting. First of all, I would like to remind you all that the telecommuting was introduced in our legislation in 2017 by the labor reform, which regulated this new fashion of working. All the telecommuting services are rendered primarily outside the company's facilities, with occasional and sporadic face-to-face meetings and trainings. Even so, I can tell you that the employee can be asked to go to the company's facilities to attend meetings. The problem here, it will be its frequency. If such events start to happen commonly, usually, I have no doubt that this regime will not be considered as telecommuting. It is also known by the fact that it involves the use of IT and communication tools. I have no doubt that for the companies that intend to reduce physical space and also even close office, this is the best regime to be adopted. Indeed, with all these social and economic crises that we are facing due to the pandemic of the COVID-19, unfortunately, lots of workers are losing their jobs. And so the companies, they're not needing so much space, physical space, as in the past. That's why we are seeing lots of companies thinking about implementing this regime in a definite way. But how can we implement it? What are the next steps for it? What should you do to adopt this regime? First of all, my advice would be review all your labor agreements. An amendment to it must be signed by the parties with the express consent of the employee. The consent of the employee, indeed, it's a legal requirement for the adoption of the telecommuting. This arrangement must also address two things. First, who is going to be liable? Who is going to be responsible for the maintenance and acquisition of the IT equipment and infrastructure? And second, the reimbursement of expenses incurred by this remote worker, such as utility bills. For the new hires, the situation is a little bit easier because you only need to state this condition in the new labor agreement. Even so, we usually recommend our clients to not only the current employees, but also for the new hires to state this condition in the labor booklets. A question that is frequently raised to us is, well, I changed my regime, I switched it to the remote one. Can I ask now the employee to come back to the company's facilities and render its service in person? The answer is yes, this is totally possible, even without the consent of the employee. The only legal requirement that must be observed here is the period of transition. And what does this mean? It means that you should communicate your employee about the change of the regime with at least 15 days in order for the employee adapt his or herself to this new reality. Another question that is commonly raised by our clients is related to overtime, the possibility of tracking the working hours of the employee. And what we have to tell you is that the employees that work on the telecommuting system, they are, in accordance with the law, not eligible for overtime. And so you should not track, you should not control their working hours. But if your company wants to adopt a more conservative approach, there's no problem on controlling the hours. you can do it, but the thing here is you should pay the overtime. Otherwise, if this employee decides to sue the company, I have no doubt that probably a labor judge is going to grant to the employee overtime with all the impacts in the labor rights. Regarding the structure of the labor environment, that is something also very important here. It's from the employers, the responsibility of providing the employee with all the equipment that he or she is going to need to perform his works or her works remotely, such as, for instance, laptops, computers, cell phones, printers, headsets, all this. And also to reimburse the employees for the expenses that they are incurring by working remotely. And this happens due to a labor principle that the employee should not run the risks of the business. Another relevant matter to be discussed with you is regarding the canceling, the exclusion of benefits when you decide to change the regime of work. Is this possible? And my answer will be, it depends on the benefit. For instance, if you're talking about transportation voucher, yes, of course, you can exclude it because the employee is going to work mostly from home. But when the company requires the presence of this employee at its facilities, there's no doubt that you should pay the transportation voucher for that days. The same rationale is for the providers of the vehicles. If the employee is not going to depend on the vehicle to perform his or her activities, there are no legal basis for you to grant this benefit. Indeed, there is even the risk that this benefit be considered as part of his or her remuneration. In other words, that this benefit be considered as salary. So our recommendation would be to exclude this benefit. On the other hand, for the meal vouchers, if they are provided in the CBA, we recommend our clients not to cancel them. In fact, it can be seen detrimental change in the employment agreements in a way that it would cause the reduction of the payment of the employee. Finally, I would like to make some brief comments regarding the work safety measures. In this case, it also belongs to the employer, the responsibility of guiding, of educating the employees about the precautionary measures to be taken in order to avoid illness or even labor accidents, especially when it comes to ergonomics. And the companies, they may instruct its employees through like a manual or even a book with all the guidelines regarding how to keep a work environment as safe and healthy. So the guidance would be about, for example, having an adequate posture, taking breaks, and also avoiding repetitive movements. Finally, we also recommend our clients that, if possible, grant to the employee the best infrastructure that it is possible, because this would certainly mitigate risks for future labor claims that may be filed when the employee may try to link the disease with the labor environment he used to perform his or her activities. Well, now I'm going to pass to Paulo Carvalho for him to make his comment.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here today. So I will talk a little bit about the social security aspects, which are the tax charges upon payroll. First of all, I would say that we are currently under the discussion of a tax reform in Brazil. So probably the taxation upon payroll will be changed in the future. But now we do not have the bills yet. So probably in next weeks, we will see if the contributions shall be reduced or if the system will be the same. But talking about the measures adopted by the federal government during the pandemic or in view of the pandemic, I would stress the provisional measure 927, which created the possibility of postponement of payment of the monthly severance fund, the so-called FGTS, during the period from April to June. The companies that have chosen to this postponement should pay these contributions in up to 6 installments from July to December 2020. This postponement have not negatively impacted the individual accounts of the employees in the FGTS because the system updated their accounts and the companies will only reimburse the system in the future. What is weird here is that this provisional measure was not converted into law as it was expected. But we just have to have in mind that during the period from April to June, the effects of the provisional measure were valid. So if the company has chosen for the postponement, it should continue making the payments from July to December. It's also important to stress that it's not a reduction in the FGTS to be paid by the company. It's only a postponement, which means that from July to December, the companies will have to pay the regular FGTS due upon the salary in addition to the postponed ones. Following the next slide, we see that this provisional measure and the postponement of the FGTS does not impact the clearance debt certificate, which are very relevant to the companies that have contracts with the public administration or bank loans, for instance. In addition, the Federal Revenue Department also extended the validity of the clearance debt certificate for 90 days and after for more 30 days, which means that during this period of the pandemic, the authorities gave a kind of relief to the companies, saying that this certificate would be valid for more time and would not impact this contract with the administration or these bank loans, for instance. In the next slide, we see the provisional measure 932. This measure actually is a reduction in the tax burden of the companies because the contributions that we call third-party contributions regularly represent a 5.8% upon the payroll, except from the SEBRAE contributions, which is 0.6%. The provisional measure stated that the other contributions that represent 5.2% were reduced in 50% during the period from April to June. So during this period, the companies have actually a tax benefit of 50% reduction of these contributions. Here we have again the problem related to the conversion of the provisional measure into law because the president rejected the article 1st of the provisional measure. But again, the fact is that from April to June, in that time, the provisional measure was valid. So if the company has paid the contributions with the reduction, it's totally okay because this was the intention of the measure and there is no discussion about that. In the next slide, we see the provisional measure 936. It created the proportional reduction in the working hours and wages, and also the temporary suspension of the employment contract. Although these measures were more employment related, we have some tax impacts here. For instance, the wages paid, even if reduction, should be considered tax basis for the social security contributions and also for the withholding income tax. But the monthly compensatory aid that the company has to pay at least of 30% of the salary, but it could be higher. This monthly compensatory aid was considered by the legislation as indemnity, which means that it's not subject to social security contributions, neither to withholding income tax. In addition, the legislation stated that this monthly compensatory aid was totally deductible from the corporate income tax basis. So it's a relevant tax benefit. In the next slide, we see the ordinance issued by the Ministry of the Economy that also postponed the employer's social security contributions upon payroll, which range from 20% to 23%. So the contributions due in April, May, and June could be postponed to August, October, and November. But again, it's only a postponement, not a reduction, which means that in August, October, and November, the companies have to pay the regular contributions due upon the salary of those months, in addition to these contributions postponed. In the next slide, we see that this postponement is also applicable to the social security contributions due upon gross revenues. For instance, those due by agro industries, rural producers, and others, and also that some ancillary obligations were also postponed to the same month. Following the next slide, we see the law 13982, which created a kind of tax benefit applicable upon the salary paid to the employees infected with coronavirus. This was created because the company has to pay the salary during the first 15 days of sick leave. As from the 16th day, the Social Security Agency pays the salary. But here the law says that the company can offset the amount of the salary of these employees with the Social Security contributions due in that month, which means that in the end of the day, the cost of the salary was transferred from the company to the Social Security Agency. But it's important to stress that, one, there is a ceiling for the amount to be offset, which is the highest amount of the retirement benefit. So if the employee has a salary up to 6,100 reais, the total amount could be offset. But if the salary is higher, the part of the salary that exceeds this amount could not be offset. And also that it's only applicable if the company understands that the infection happened in the work environment, or if the infection is work related, which means that if the employee was infected during the period that he was rendering services to the company. This is important to have in mind because if the company understands that the infection is work related, okay, there is this tax benefit, but there are also other downsides. For instance, employment stability and increasing in the SAT contributions, which are the contributions related to the work environment disease. But if the company understands that the infection was not related to the work environment, so there would be grounds to avoid this other labor and tax impact, but the company would not be allowed to have this tax benefit to offset the salary during the 15 days, meaning that the company would have to pay the regular salary during the first 15 days, as it occurs to the other disease in the normal routine of the company. So I believe that these are the main issues related to the payroll charges that were enacted during the pandemic. Thank you all for the time, and I'll revert back to Leticia.
Thank you, Paulo. I would like to thank again our panelists and all of you who attended our session today. As we could hear firsthand, there is a range of different topics to be considered. They go from legal and HR aspects to being an employer who is actually aligned with the new market practices. As Marina mentioned during her session, we really could continue here debating these aspects for days. But one thing is certain, employment relationships will be forever impacted by the current pandemic that we are all living. As challenging as COVID-19 is and has been on all of us and our families, it has unwillingly triggered a more modern and flexible way to work. We did receive some questions in the chat during our session, and it's still open if you would like to post a question. The questions received have already been answered directly to the participants, but please do feel free to reach out to us later should you have any further doubts. So unless there are any new questions posted to the chat, and I can see that there are not. So with this, we close our panel this afternoon, and thank you all again for participating. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.